Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I've managed the Callaway Arms for 5 years, and I know this building the way you know something you're responsible for, which is different from the way you know something you just live in. I know the way the boiler in the south mechanical room sounds when it's working correctly, and the slightly different sound it makes when it's thinking about not working correctly. I know which units run cold in January and which run hot in August, and which tenants will call about it and which will silently suffer. I know the elevator's particular reluctance on cold mornings, and the third floor hallway light that needs its fixture replaced every 8 months like clockwork, and the specific leak pattern of the roof above Unit 612 that only shows up during heavy rain from the northeast. 112 units. I know most of the residents by name and a significant number by the particular nature of their maintenance requests, which tells you more about a person than you'd think. I'm good at this job. I don't say that to establish anything other than context for what follows, which is that when something about this building doesn't add up, I notice. I've been noticing things that don't add up about what happened last October for 7 months now. And I've decided to write it down because writing it down is the closest thing I have to doing something with it. The northeast corner of the basement is the oldest part of the building. The Callaway Arms went up in 1963, and the infrastructure in that corner is original to the construction, which means it's the kind of utility space that was built to function rather than to be looked at. Bare concrete block, exposed conduit, the original gas distribution manifold that feeds the building's older units, a section of water main that was partially updated in the 90s but not completely. Functional and unglamorous, and something I checked on a regular cycle as part of my maintenance rounds. I had been in that corner 6 weeks before the evacuation. A routine check, nothing prompting it. Just the scheduled walkthrough I did every 2 months. Everything was the way it always was. I was in there for maybe 10 minutes. Nothing to log. That's the baseline. That corner was unremarkable in every way I knew how to measure for the entire 5 years I'd been in this building. Then 3 residents on the 3rd floor called about a smell. They called within the same week, which I noted but didn't initially weight heavily because 3rd floor calls tended to cluster. Something about the building's ventilation pattern meant that whatever the 3rd floor was experiencing, they experienced it together. 3 calls about a smell wasn't inherently alarming. It was a pattern I knew. What gave me pause was the descriptions. I talked to all 3 of them in person, which I do when something is ambiguous enough that I want more than a phone summary. They were all trying to describe the same thing and all landing in slightly different places. One said it smelled like something old, like the inside of a space that had been sealed for a long time and was releasing whatever had accumulated in it. One said it was like the air before a thunderstorm, but with something underneath that the air before a thunderstorm didn't have. One, a woman on the northwest end of the floor named Petra, who had lived in the building for 3 years and who was not dramatic about things, said she couldn't smell it anymore, but that she'd been having a pressure behind her eyes since the week it started, and the two things felt connected to her. I did a walkthrough of the third floor, and then the basement beneath it. In the northeast corner, the air was different. I stood in it for a minute, trying to identify the difference, and couldn't get more specific than different. Not a smell I recognized, not a temperature variation, not anything I could point to and name, just a quality to the air in that corner that the air in the rest of the basement didn't have. My flashlight dimmed for about 10 seconds while I was standing directly in the corner. A slow fade, and then a slow return to full brightness, and the flashlight was battery-powered, and I'd put fresh batteries in it 2 weeks before. I checked the manifold, and the water main, and the conduit runs. Nothing visibly wrong. I called maintenance, and they came the next day, and found nothing wrong either. I called the utility company as a precaution, the way you do when you've done everything available to you and you want someone with different instruments to take a look. I expected them to find nothing and clear it, and I expected to spend another week following up with the third floor residents until whatever it was resolved itself. That's not what happened. The inspector's name was Veach. He came the following morning with a bag of equipment and a manner that I read as professional and unhurried, which I appreciated. I walked him through the building and then into the basement, and he spent about 15 minutes in the northeast corner with his instruments, while I stood at the edge of the space and watched his back. When he turned around, he told me he was detecting an anomalous reading and that he was recommending evacuation of the building pending further assessment. He said it could be a slow leak in the original gas infrastructure, that the old manifold in that section was the right age to develop undetected faults, and that evacuation was the responsible action. I've dealt with gas leak responses twice in 5 years. I know what they look like. I started noticing the ways this one didn't look like them before the evacuation was even complete. The utility vehicles that arrived weren't marked the standard way, not unbranded exactly, but marked differently. A logo I didn't recognize on the side of 2 of the vans that wasn't the utility company's standard livery. There were 6 vehicles total, which was more than any gas leak response I'd seen required. The people going into the basement after the residents were out were wearing equipment I didn't recognize the purpose of, not the standard gear a gas response team brought, and they were carrying things in with them in cases that had been loaded in the vehicles before they arrived, which meant the cases had been prepared before anyone from their team had assessed the space. I asked Veach if I could follow the team into the basement to observe. He told me access was restricted to the response team for the duration of the assessment. I asked how long. He said 9 days minimum. I said 9 days was significantly longer than standard protocol for a gas leak response. He said the nature of the anomalous reading warranted a thorough assessment, and that 9 days was a conservative estimate that protected the residents. I stood in the parking lot of my own building and watched the back entrance and didn't say what I was thinking, which was that nothing about what I was looking at was a gas leak response. I stayed in the area. I have a sister in Columbus who offered her couch, and I took it at night, but I came back to the neighborhood every day because my job didn't stop, because the building was evacuated. The residents needed coordination. The temporary housing needed managing. The insurance documentation needed to be started. I had things to do. And I did them. And I watched the building. Day 1 and 2. Continuous activity. People going in and out of the back entrance, the service entrance that the residents didn't use. Not hurried, not dramatic. Working steadily the way people work when they have a job with a lot of steps and they're moving through them in order. Day 2, a generator. Brought in on a flatbed in the afternoon and set up behind the building and running by evening. The building's power was on. I could see that from the outside, the emergency lighting visible through the lobby windows. The generator was supplemental to something, not a replacement for something. Day 3 and 4, a vehicle in the back lot I couldn't identify. Not a utility van, not a construction vehicle. A large plain vehicle that sat in the lot those 2 days and was gone by day 5 without anything that looked like loading or unloading that I witnessed. I talked to Ash on day 4. He's lived on the 3rd floor for 11 years, and he's the kind of person who notices things without making a production of it. He told me he'd first noticed the smell about 6 weeks before the evacuation, which was 2 weeks before the first resident calls came in, and that he'd assumed it was a ventilation issue and hadn't bothered me with it. He described the smell at its peak about 2 weeks before the evacuation, in terms that I wrote down afterward because I wanted to get them exactly right. He said it didn't smell like gas. He said it smelled like something that had been waiting in a closed space for a very long time and had recently started to move. I thought about that phrasing for the rest of the day. I talked to Petra on day 6. The pressure behind her eyes had stopped the night of the evacuation. Not gradually, not over the days that followed. She said she remembered crossing the street with her evacuation bag and feeling it stop, like something had been turned off. She said it was a relief, and that the relief itself was frightening because it told her the pressure had a source, and the source was the building. I thought about radius. I thought about a source in a specific location and an effect that reached a certain distance and stopped where the distance ran out. On day 9, the residents came back. I walked the building before I let anyone in. The full circuit, every corridor, and every floor, and every utility space. The building was clean. Nothing moved. Nothing missing. No visible evidence of 9 days of work except the smell, which was gone entirely, and the northeast corner of the basement, where there was now a wall. It was a good wall. Concrete block, finished with the same texture coat as the surrounding walls, close enough in color that it read as existing construction if you weren't looking for it. I was looking for it. I stood in front of it and ran my hand along the surface, and it was solid and cold and built with the materials and technique of something meant to stay. I called Veitch. He told me the original infrastructure in that section had been decommissioned and sealed, that it was standard procedure for aged systems that couldn't be brought up to current code, and that the building's current systems were fully functional. He said it in the tone of someone reading from a document they've read from before. I asked for the inspection report and decommissioning documentation. He said I'd receive it within 10 business days. That was 7 months ago. I spent the following weeks going through everything I could access. My own maintenance records for that corner going back to when I took the job, all clean, nothing anomalous until the week of the first smell reports. The building's original construction documents, which I requested from the city's records office and received after a 2-week wait. showing the northeast corner as a standard utility space. Nothing unusual. The utility company's public service records for the Callaway Arms address, which I accessed through the public inquiry process and which showed normal service history up to a gap that began about 8 weeks before the evacuation and ended 2 weeks before the evacuation with a notation I'd never seen in a utility record. A code, not a standard service code, not any classification I could find in the utility company's publicly available documentation. 6 characters that appeared once in the service history and corresponded to no category I could identify. I called the utility company's records line and asked what the code meant. The person I spoke to was polite and unhelpful in the specific way of someone who has been told what to say about a specific inquiry. She said it was an internal classification not available for public inquiry. I asked if she could tell me which department used it. She said she wasn't able to provide that information. I asked if there was someone else I could speak to. She said she'd note my inquiry and someone would follow up. Nobody followed up. I thought about the order of things. Something was present in the northeast corner 6 weeks before the evacuation because Ash smelled it 6 weeks before. The utility company's records showed a notation 2 weeks before the evacuation. Not a visit, not a service call, a notation, which meant someone in the utility company's system was aware of the Callaway Arms address 2 weeks before Veach walked into my basement with equipment prepared in advance, which meant they knew before I called them. I found Gordy by accident. He manages a complex in Indiana, a building about the age of mine in a mid-sized city I'd driven through once. I know him through a regional property managers association, the kind of professional organization you join because the networking is occasionally useful and the annual conference gives you a hotel room to yourself for 3 nights. We talked a few times over the years about things like insurance rate increases and maintenance contractor availability, the conversations of people in the same industry who aren't in each other's markets. He called me in February about something else entirely, a question about a contractor I'd used, and we talked for a while the way you do when you've been inside for several months and the sound of a familiar voice is its own value. Somewhere in it, he mentioned, in the way you mention things that are still sitting with you, even when you're trying not to let them, that he'd had a strange experience with a utility company response the previous year. I asked him to describe it. 9-day evacuation, new wall in the basement, documentation that never arrived. I asked him which corner of the basement. He said northeast. I asked about third-floor smell reports before the evacuation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how I knew that. We talked for 2 hours. His building was in Indiana. Mine was in Ohio. Different cities, different utility providers, different construction eras. The buildings didn't share any contractor relationships, any management company, any common vendor. There was no thread connecting them except the northeast corner and the 9 days and the new wall and the utility code in the records gap that Gordy had also found and also couldn't identify. I asked him if he'd tried to find out what was behind the wall. He was quiet in a way that told me he'd thought about it seriously before deciding against it. He said he'd concluded that some things were better left as questions than answers, and that he'd made his peace with not knowing. He said he thought I should think carefully about which kind of person I wanted to be, the kind who kept pulling at it, or the kind who let it be a thing that happened and moved on. I told him I appreciated that, and I understood what he was saying. I didn't tell him it was already too late for that I was already the other kind of person, and had been since the night I stood in the parking lot of my own building, watching the back entrance with a generator running behind a wall I managed and no access to any of it. I'm writing this from my apartment on the 4th floor of the Callaway Arms. The building is quiet tonight. It's late, and most of the lights are off in most of the units, and I can hear the boiler in the south mechanical room doing the thing it does when it's working correctly, which is a sound I've been listening to for 5 years, and which is one of the sounds that means everything is fine. I've been down to the northeast corner of the basement more times than I've counted since the residents came back, not investigating, not with tools or anything beyond my eyes and my hand, just standing in front of the wall the way I stood in front of it the first time, putting my hand on it and feeling that it's solid and cold and tells me nothing. I've looked up the code from the utility records gap in every public database I know how to use and asked 2 people who've worked in utility infrastructure for their careers, and neither of them recognized it. One of them said it didn't match any standard classification system used by any utility provider he was aware of, and that if it was in the records, it was either a proprietary internal code or something entered outside the standard system. He said both of those things were unusual and that he'd be curious to know more. I told him I'd let him know if I found anything. I've thought about Ash, who smelled something in that corner for 6 weeks and didn't call it in, and who seems fine, entirely himself. Same dry humor and same precise way of describing things when we talk in the hallway. I've thought about Petra, whose pressure stopped the moment she crossed the street and was far enough from the building, far enough from the northeast corner, far enough from whatever was in the northeast corner and is now behind a wall that the people who built it built to stay. I've thought about sealed versus removed. The wall is not a remediation. A remediation cleans something out and makes the space safe and documents what it removed. Whatever was in that corner wasn't removed. It was sealed. The people who built the wall built it knowing what was on the other side of it and made the decision that sealing was the appropriate response, which means removing was either not possible or not something they considered. That distinction is the one I can't stop turning over. I've thought about other buildings, about Gordy's complex in Indiana and the northeast corner of his basement, and whether his 3rd floor residents have been fine since they came back. And I've thought about how many other buildings there might be, with new walls in northeast corners and utility records with codes that don't appear in any public classification system. I've thought about what it would mean if there were many of them, what it would mean about something that shows up in the northeast corners of older buildings in the middle of ordinary cities and stays long enough to affect the people living above it and then gets sealed behind a wall by people who arrived with materials already prepared. I've thought about what was there 6 weeks before anyone called it in, what it was doing in that corner for 6 weeks before it became noticeable enough to report. I've thought about the 10 minutes I spent in that corner 6 weeks before the evacuation during my routine walkthrough, and whether the flashlight dimming was the first time it had dimmed in that corner, or just the first time I'd been there, with fresh batteries recent enough to notice. I do the last walkthrough of the building every night before I lock up. It's part of the job. I check every floor and every utility space and every mechanical room, and at the end, I come to the northeast corner of the basement and I stand in front of the wall. I put my hand on it. It's solid. It's cold. It's the same every time. I stand there for a moment in the quiet of the building at night, and I think about what's on the other side of it and what was on the other side of Gordy's wall in Indiana, and what is on the other side of however many other walls there are in however many other buildings, all of them sealed, all of them cold, all of them built to last by people who knew before they arrived what they were going to find. Then I turn off the light. I go upstairs. I do the same thing tomorrow.